Thank you for joining this presentation. I'm sure that everybody watching this virtual conference has been affected one way or another during the COVID-19 pandemic. In this presentation, I aim to do several things. Firstly, to revisit the MLC 2006, what it does or doesn't do, numbers, and to whom it applies. Secondly, to discuss the pandemic and the impact on MLC 2006 compliance. Thirdly, to talk about the post-pandemic situation and the procedural plan for moving forward. And finally, to provocatively ask, will everything ever get back to normal? The pandemic has created a global crisis impacting all lives and adversely affecting the world of work. Maritime was severely disrupted, and the functioning of shipping has affected nearly 2 million seafarers worldwide. Hundreds of thousands of seafarers required immediate repatriation following tours of duty. Some were over 17 consecutive months and often unable to access shore-based leave and/or medical treatment. Equal number of seafarers also needed to be found as replacements. Seafarer fatigue immensely risked physical and mental health, safe navigation, security, and marine environment protection. Numerous governments and seafarers and shipowners organisations contacted the ILO about such complexities. In December 2020, the ILO Committee of Experts acknowledged observations from the social partners and some governments' replies and addressed many implementation concerns. Under the MLC, derogations, exemptions, or other clauses allowing government flexibility in application required consultation with the social partners and relevant governments. Such consultations were necessary and key to ensuring all countries, regardless of national circumstances, engage with the international legal system and international obligations are respected and implemented, whilst efforts continue to improve existing conditions, and governments should consult national social partners to address these. ITF alleged that MLC ratifying countries use force majeure to shield against compliance. The Committee of Experts noted that the MLC applies to all ratifying countries and cannot be selectively applied. Early on, ratifying states experienced genuine force majeure situations, rendering it impossible to comply with some obligations. However, the Committee of Experts argued that 10 months on, there was a realistically sufficient time to explore and apply new modalities which met labour standards. Due to government measures, hundreds of thousands of seafarers were requested to remain on board beyond their SEAs. Extension of these must be in line with applicable national laws and regulations, and in all cases, seafarers' consent is fundamental. The MLC states that SEAs shall be agreed to by the seafarer under conditions that they can review and seek advice on, and freely accept before signing. A valid SEA must remain in focus until a seafarer is duly repatriated. ITF alleged that failure to arrange seafarer repatriation on completion of a contract effectively forced extension of contracts where consent cannot be freely given. MLC Article 3 states that states shall ensure that their laws and regulation respect the fundamental rights to eliminate forced or compulsory labour. Therefore, it was seen that such inaction was inappropriate and needed to be sorted immediately. Ratifying states also failed to comply with MLC Article 1, which states members shall cooperate to effectively implement and enforce the Convention, despite numerous governments undertaking important bilateral, regional and international level actions to identify solutions and generate initiatives to overcome challenges. Evidence suggested that provisions continued to be disregarded worldwide. This constituted a sufficient basis to conclude that all members did not comply with Article 1. The MLC prohibits implementation to be temporarily suspended in case of crisis, health-related or otherwise, as this is when protective minimum standard coverage assumes most significance and must be scrupulously applied. Government should adopt necessary measures together with the social partners to cooperate to ensure effective implementation and enforcement. Now, there were also measures for ratifying states to adapt both flag state responsibilities, port state responsibilities, and labour supply state responsibilities. And unfortunately, each category did not play their part in fulfilling these roles, including provision of access to vaccines, quarantine facilities, repatriation, etc. MLC Article 4 states that every seafarer has a right to a safe and secure workplace, complying with safety standards and to health protection, medical care, welfare measures and other forms of social protection. And it has responsibilities for both flag and port states, as well as also labour supply countries. And it was of real concern to us that many port states' medical departments seemed to ignore the fact that their countries had ratified the MLC and refused to provide shore-based medical assistance as and when required. This is clearly in breach of Article 28 of the WHO International Health Regulations, and also for the WHO operational considerations for managing COVID cases on board or outbreak on board ships, which contains information on measures to adopt before boarding a ship and managing COVID cases on board. It is imperative for member states to try to facilitate delivery of essential medical supplies, fuel, water, spare parts and victuals to ships. Some global ports refuse to allow some ships entry, which previously called at ports which were affected by COVID, preventing vessels obtaining essential supplies. And suppliers were also prevented from globally boarding ships to supply masks, overall and other PPE required. Seafarers must have access to plentiful supplies and equipment, as listed in the IMGS and other medical guidance. And again, this proved somewhat difficult in the early stages of the pandemic. And as I said before, governments have been encouraged to provide access to vaccinations for seafarers in foreign countries. And we're encouraged that some countries have now started to take this on, but many more are still well behind in this regard. And there's a real concern that booster jabs will further inhibit the opportunities for ship owners to be able to access vaccines for their seafarers on board their vessels. Flag states were also required to facilitate seafarer transit, transfer and repatriation. And as I stated earlier, this has been a big bone of contention, which I'm sure most of you will be aware of, has not happened as smoothly as required by the Convention. Seafarers were also urgently called to be recognised as key workers by a number of UN bodies, the UN General Assembly, the ILO governing body, the IMO Maritime Safety Committee, just to name a few. Yet, despite these measures, only 55 countries were able to designate seafarers as key workers in January of this year, when IMO asked for that information. Both the IMO Secretary General and the ILO Director General affirmed that no crew change clauses undermined efforts undertaken to solve the existing crisis and exacerbated mental and physical fatigue amongst exhausted seafarers. They requested charterers to cease requesting such charter party clauses and advised ship owners and operators to reject them if demanded. And in January this year, over 300 signatories supported the Neptune Declaration on Seafarer Wellbeing and Crew Change and committed to resolve the crew change crisis. Other measures which required addressing included respecting the maximum period of service on board, ensuring minimum staff manning, medical and training certification, maritime labour certificates and inspections, entitlements to paid sick leave in case of infection or quarantine, and access to shore leave and welfare facilities during the pandemic. And as we all know, shore leave is vital to benefit seafarers' health and well-being. There were also, unfortunately, additional challenges in resolving abandonment cases prior to the outbreak. The IMO database of reported seafarer abandonment cases showed a drastic increase in late 2020, with some cases linked to COVID measures. Even during COVID, flag, port and labour supply states are bound by MLC repatriation requirements and relevant provisions. So what are the recommendations for the way forward in the post-COVID world? Well, firstly, to restore protection of seafarers' rights, to extend seafarer employment agreements, whether free, formal, and with informed consent. Member states need to stop being only willing to work to their own agendas and need to cooperate with one another. And the measures must be adopted by ratifying states, which they've signed up to under the MLC. And as I said, there are clearly flag state, port state, and I would also add labour supply state responsibilities, which need to be honoured. Seafarer health and safety must be protected, as well as the transit and transfer of seafarers and repatriation facilitated. More countries immediately need to recognise seafarers as key workers, and in so doing, ensure that they have access to vaccinations, medical care, and also prompt repatriation when required. In return, ship owners must respect the maximum period of service on board, and to do this, port states must allow seafarers to be able to leave the vessels to return home to their countries. Minimum manning levels must be maintained to ensure ship safety, and certification, whether for medical certificates, training and qualifications, maritime labour certificates and inspections, must all be up to date. And finally, social protection measures, including the seafarer's entitlement to paid sick leave in case of infection or quarantine, must be honoured. And seafarers should be able to access shore leave and welfare facilities in a future pandemic, wherever this is safe to do so. And finally, the abandonment of seafarers is getting worse. The effects of the current pandemic are horrific, and one can only hope that future measures are taken to ensure that seafarers who are affected are properly looked after. Thank you for your time.